Hello, a very good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Raghavendra from the Faculty of Dentistry, and I'm the moderator for today's webinar. MAHSA is celebrating the November thematic month with a main focus on the theme empathy and being empathetic. As a part of our celebration, we are organizing a webinar on practicing empathy during COVID-19 times. So 2020 has been and still continues to be an unprecedented experience for all of us across the world due to COVID-19 pandemic. It has changed the way we live, socialize, work, and these changes have presented us with challenges at varying degrees depending on our individual situations. Some of the questions we tend to ask ourselves frequently, like how do we cope with our emotions during these challenging times? How do we understand others in the face of a COVID-19 challenges? So this talk will addresses these questions and others with a particular focus on empathy, its meaning and implications on the mental health of an individual in both workplace and in personal areas of life. So I would like to introduce our today's speaker, Ms. Sharon Lillian Howe, who is a senior lecturer in the health psychology and head of unit from psychiatry, MAHSA University. Ms. Sharon moved to Malaysia from her native England in the year 2011 and is affiliated with MAHSA University since 2015. She has many years of teaching and counseling experiences both in the UK and Malaysia. She has taught undergraduates and postgraduate students in both psychology and health sciences. She has previously worked in University of Liverpool and National Health Services in the UK, where she has involved in smoking cessation program and training healthcare professionals in the principles of health behavior. So without any delay, I would like to welcome Ms. Sharon Lillian Ho for her presentation. Ms. Sharon, the screen is yours. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. And first of all, I would like to say a very good afternoon to everybody here. I hope that everybody is feeling well in these troubled times. Before I start, I would like to give some acknowledgements. First of all, I would like to thank you to Dr. Shiva of the Dental Faculty for inviting me to give this talk on a very important and timely topic. I would like to say thank you to Marcom, Mr. Tan, and all who have been involved in the arrangements for advertising this webinar and, of course, the technical support, because without them, this would not be possible. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to give an overview. I always like to give an overview of the topics that I'm going to talk about, and then I will go into more details as I go through. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, the context of mental health and COVID-19. I know this talk is about empathy, but before we can actually talk about empathy, we also need to talk about mental health and the context of it. And then, of course, to talk about specific psychological problems associated with COVID-19. Then I'm going to talk about social support and resilience. And then I'm going to start talking about empathy. So I'm going to give a definition of empathy. I'm going to say why we should show empathy and why it is important. And then I'm going to say how we can actually practice empathy towards others. And then I'm going to talk about reflective writing. Because many of these things we can talk about, but how do we actually use them? And so we need to try and understand how we can use the concepts that I'm going to talk about today in a practical context. So I hope that I can achieve that, and I'm looking forward to giving this talk. As I say, it's a very timely topic in these troubled times. Okay, so as we heard in the introduction, this year, 2020, has been and continues to be a challenging year for all of us, the world over, not just locally. I mean, if we think now, we are now in November, and this COVID-19 has been with us for almost 1 year. So it shows, how time really does go fast. I mean, it just seems, a whole year almost with this. And because of that, we have had to adapt to many different things. And these are in no particular order. Certainly, one of the things we've had to adapt to has been working situations and SOPs. You know, now it's no more the case that we can go to work and just clock in and then walk around the offices without having first had our temperature taken, wearing a mask. You know, this is the first time I'm not wearing a mask actually for a very long time. Wearing a mask has now become a part of our costume. At least that's how I think about it. Our homes have now become our offices. You know, we've been working from home. And of course, you know, that means that there has been no demarcation between our home and our office. Everything is kind of rolled together in one. Then, of course, we find we have to adapt to new ways of socializing with loved ones and friends and colleagues. You know, it's not the same anymore that we can sit, you know, very close together over dinner tables. You know, now, of course, when we're out, that is, you know, we have to wear masks, we have to keep this social distancing. So these are things we've had to change. Then, of course, new ways of carrying out everyday activities, which to us have always been second nature. Things like going shopping in the mall, going shopping in the supermarket. Everything has changed quite drastically. Many of us have relatives and friends abroad. I have relatives abroad. Many people have lost their jobs and livelihoods. So we have had to adjust to many new situations. And this looks like it is likely to continue for some time to come at this current moment in time. So having said, given an introduction, I mean, of course, what I've mentioned is not exhaustive. I mean, there are many things that are different to many of us. And of course, that would depend on our specific situations and circumstances. But what is the psychological impact of COVID-19? Well, now there's been a lot written about this, and of course, stress, depression, anxiety, panic, feelings of helplessness, because we cannot do anything about this virus. We cannot do anything about it, this coronavirus, it's here. And so when we have something that we are not able to control, then of course that can create feelings of helplessness for some people. Not everybody, but for some people. Then, of course, come with that, there might be anger, there might be confusion about what is going to happen. Anger might be because now we have to follow a set SOP. As I said in the introduction, we are no longer able to go around and do our daily business as we once used to. Then, of course, there's fears for the future, and that of loved ones. Fears, you know, of catching the virus, fears that our loved ones may catch it. So all these kinds of things can have a huge impact psychologically. And what does the evidence say about mental health and COVID? Well, there might be feelings of mass hysteria. There may be these pervasive feelings of hopelessness and desperation associated with what psychologists call as negative outcomes, maladaptive outcomes. Maladaptive means that we are not able to adapt to situations. And then, of course, you know, underpinning that, of course, is the socio-economic impact, which really, all of these things are linked together. We cannot say that one thing on its own is a problem. Everything, especially when we talk about mental health, when we talk about health, everything is linked together. So socio-economic impact, of course, I mentioned in the introduction, or I mentioned earlier, people losing their livelihoods, people losing their jobs, which of course then leads to or has an impact on people's socio-economic status. So everything is linked, and it really can be quite troubling for very many people. So I think that this is what I want to set in context before I talk about other things. And then we talk about impact on overall well-being and functioning. That is what health psychologists and psychologists in general always think about, the factors thought to impair our overall well-being and functioning. Impairment, of course, in this context means something which has an impact, something which interferes. So the things that I mentioned earlier are things which can impair our well-being and functioning. Functioning meaning, of course, that we are not able to do the things we wanted to do so freely anymore. One of the things, of course, one of the big fears for all of us is the fear of becoming infected with COVID-19. That is one of the biggest fears probably for a lot of people. Anxiety, the feelings of anxiety of catching the virus. Frustration, of course, meaning again that we feel frustrated because this impacts on our lives. We can't travel anymore, at least certainly not at the moment. We cannot travel. We are restricted. And when we are restricted, then we have a lack of autonomy. Lack of autonomy meaning that we are not able to do the things we want to do. Then, of course, there's boredom, loneliness. Loneliness for some people may be an issue, particularly those people who live on their own, or elderly people, for example. Even our students, living on their own at university, perhaps those who cannot go home. Again, loneliness could be an issue. And then we have to think about the impact on our emotions, leading to maladaptive thoughts, leading to overthinking. When somebody is not happy and then they start thinking, what's going to be next? If I catch the virus, what then is going to happen? Will I become seriously ill? Will I recover? Will I give that virus to somebody else? So all these things can have an impact on our overall well-being and quality of life. So quality of life, you may be wondering, what is quality of life? Well, quality of life is an area in psychology, in health psychology, which looks at our subjective overall quality of life. So subjective, of course, means my opinion of my quality of life compared with yours and compared with others. So each and every one of us will have different circumstances. Not everyone's experience is going to be the same. But when we start talking about overall quality of life, we are meaning here, psychologists mean, all the things that I have mentioned, anxiety, frustration, fear. These are all things which can stop us from doing the things which we enjoy and therefore lead to some impairment on our quality of life. However, that said, there are protective factors. So in psychology, we talk about things which protect us psychologically. So I'm going to talk about two main things or two main factors. One is social support and one is resilience. When we talk about social support, what does that actually mean? Well, it's quite, an abstract way of thinking about things, but actually it's very, very simple. And it is something which we all know about, except that we don't really think very much about it in detail. Social support refers to the various ways in which individuals can aid or help other people. It is well documented as playing an important and positive role in the health and well-being of others. Now you will see that I have, throughout this presentation, I have underlined or I have made some points in bold, but that's not to say that those are any more important than others, because everything that I'm saying is important, but they are those salient points to remind me of what I should be explaining to my audience. So when it says well documented, that means that it's well understood. And positive role, what do we mean when we talk about positive role? Well, positive role, of course, means that there is something that we can take away from whatever negativity we may be experiencing. We may be thinking, okay, During the MCO, when the MCO first started in March and when everybody was in lockdown, we may be thinking, what was there that was positive about that? Instead of thinking about the positive things, we tend to focus on the negative things. But actually, I did ask some of my students, okay, guys, so what came out for you as being positive? And some of them looked at me, and when they were not really quite sure of what I was asking, and so then I explained what I meant, and they said, oh yes, well, we learned to cook. We learned to make tea. We learned to communicate with others much more clearly than we'd previously done. Because we could no longer go out and eat, so we cooked at home. And so that was something that somebody learned. Okay, so to go back to social support, playing an important positive role in the health and well-being of others. So that means that somebody somewhere along the line is helping somebody else. Social support has often been summarized as a network of individuals on whom one can rely on for psychological or material support to cope effectively with stress or whatever else it might be that that person is having problems with. It is theorized to be offered in the form of instrumental support. So it can be material support, perhaps giving somebody a gift. It can be appraisal or information support. Appraisal or informational support in the field of health psychology means, appraisal, weighing up the pros and cons, thinking about the positives and the negatives. And it can involve things like advice, guidance, feedback, okay? Emotional support, on the other hand, is about reassurance of worth, reassurance of somebody's worth, showing empathy and affection. I'm going to cover these a bit more in detail when I start talking about empathy, so don't worry too much about at this point about what they actually mean. Then we talk about resilience. So I'm sure that we all know what resilience means. Resilience comes from the field of positive psychology, which was developed by Martin Seligman back in 2000, so quite some time ago. But positive psychology and resilience and all these kinds of words are relatively new to the field of psychology. But when we talk about resilience, what we mean is the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or significant sources of stress, which we are all or may be suffering now. We can say that this COVID-19 is an adverse, something adverse. It's unprecedented. And it means significant sources of stress like family and relationship problems, serious health problems, or workplace and financial stressors. Resilience involves bouncing back from these difficult experiences. It can also involve profound personal growth. So in layman's terms, what we're talking about here is, that we are going to bounce back from these difficult experiences. Of course, we have to look for positives, which is not very easy sometimes because that also involves personality type, which I'm not going to cover today. But that is really what we are talking about, or I am talking about when I talk about resilience. So you might be wondering, okay, well, how does this apply? So how do all these factors relate to mental health and empathy? What does it all mean? Because it's all very well talking about these things, but we really want to know, what does it mean? Well, process of social support in itself can be a great source of comfort in times of trouble. And I'm not just talking about during COVID-19, I'm talking about in general. If somebody phones you up, if you're feeling sad and somebody notices that you're feeling sad, and later on I'm going to talk about that, and then, asking after somebody's welfare. How are you today? Is a form of social support in itself. It's emotional support. Resilience is important for our mental health and can be increased by finding purpose in life, embracing change, developing a strong network. So finding purpose in life might be something like, okay, now I've learned to do something different because I have been in lockdown and we've been, obviously we can't do the things that we used to be able to do. So we find another purpose. And then from that, we embrace change. Okay, I can't do this. Now I can do this. So this is something else I can do. And of course, developing a strong network. So of course, a strong network means friends, family, colleagues, all these people that, we see along the way. Facebook, WhatsApp, keeping in touch. All these things can help us build resilience. And then when we talk about experiences, when we start talking about our experience and we listen to others' experiences, sometimes if others' experiences are more adverse than our own, then we can think, imagine what it must be like. I'm not in that situation. So social support is very, very important. Very, very important. I always emphasize this to my students. And then, once I start talking about that, then they realize, how important it is for recovery of illnesses and mental health and all these things. So it's very important. Now I'm going to talk about empathy. So what I've done so far is I've talked about mental health in general because I've had to talk about mental health. I've had to talk about, the adverse effects on somebody's mental health or potential. So I want to say at this point, I've talked about stress, I've talked about depression. Every single going to have depression or develop depression because of this situation. I'm just simply saying that these are some of the things that can occur. So now when we talk about empathy, so first of all, if I'm going to talk about empathy, I need to give a definition. This is a definition that's been taken from a textbook which I have called Empathy in Health Professions, Education and Patient Care. Mohammed Reza Hojat is an expert in the field of researching empathy. Many papers and articles and books have been written about empathy. So that will show you, just how the magnitude of it and how important it is. And we will soon learn how important it is as we go through further. But this quote, which was taken from that book, is a Persian mystical poet and philosopher. And it said, the quote, "To be one in heart is enchanting, more than to be one in tongue." So I guess what we can say about that is that really, if we want to pick that quote apart, we might want to say that, things in our heart are more important than things in our tongue. And so therefore, perhaps we should be careful what we say to people, especially in these times of distress, because we don't know what people are going through. We don't know that. So more about that later. And then there's another definition. I always like to put definitions in my talks because they set it into context. And this is a quote from a textbook written by Susan Lanzoni, who talks about the history of empathy. And she says that empathy is our capacity to grasp and understand the mental and emotional lives of others. It is deemed a trained skill, a talent, or an inborn ability, and accorded a psychological and moral nature. So that quote is a bit more substantial than the one I gave just now. There are a lot of key words in this definition. Our capacity, so that means each and every one of our own capacity to grasp, to get the idea, if I want to put it into layman's terms, get the idea or understand or try to understand the mental and emotional lives of others. So in other words, as I will say later on, we're trying to, really understand what someone is going through. Now, a trained skill, again, later I'm going to talk a bit about that. There are articles to say that empathy can be trained, or it can even be inborn, okay? And then, of course, it relates to our psychological and moral nature of an individual. Now, I need to say a little bit about differences between empathy and sympathy. So sympathy is feeling sorry for someone. Empathy is more about being able to feel someone else's pain. Imagine, in other words, what they are going through. Being able to put ourselves in others' shoes. Being able to put themselves in others' shoes. This is the difference. Now, there are 4 essential elements of empathy. Empathy actually also comes from the field of counselling. Carl Rogers, in his person-centred therapy, talked about this many, many years ago when he talked about his unconditional positive regard, in a counselling perspective. But we're not going to talk about counselling today, but this is an important framework or elements that have come from counselling that I'm going to talk about. So as I said just now, the first one is being able to see the world as others see it, taking their perspective. So again, it's about this imagine, you put yourself in their shoes for 1 minute, take their perspective. Being non-judgmental is a very important part of empathy, being empathetic. Not being judgmental, not judging people, not thinking too much about, or they are this and they are that, not to be judgmental, to be non-judgmental. In other words, to take a step back and think first before we judge. Then, of course, recognizing emotions, understanding others, and communicating that understanding. When I teach my students, I talk the faces of emotion, which is Paul Ekman's universal faces of emotions. And I always ask them, why do you need to know about emotions? Actually, we can read a lot in somebody's face. We can read a lot through their facial expressions. We can gain an understanding. We can see whether somebody is upset. We can see whether somebody is angry. We can see whether somebody's not sure. We can see whether somebody has fear. So, of course, that may be something that not everybody will know about unless they teach it or unless, they have studied that. But that is a part of empathy, body language, and communicating that understanding to others, communicating that you are understanding others' perspective. Empathy is a key element of emotional intelligence. So emotional intelligence nowadays is taught very much about skills, how we communicate with others. Are we able to understand other people's emotions as we go through our daily lives? Okay, again, emotional intelligence is another topic on its own. It's just that I've put this last sentence in to say it's a key element of emotional intelligence because empathy is. There are different types of empathy. I'm going to talk about cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy, cognitive psychology is a whole field of psychology on its own within psychology. So cognitive psychology is about perception, about memory, intelligence. Cognitions is our awareness, our cognitions. So this comes into the taking another person's perspective. And again, this is part of imagining yourself in someone else's shoes, understanding someone else's feelings. This is cognitive empathy and being aware. So I'm sure that you can see that there is an overlap of many of these different concepts. There is a huge overlap. Some of these things have been mentioned just previously, but in different contexts. And then, of course, we have emotional empathy. So that's going back to sharing an emotional experience, feeling distress in response to the pain of others. And again, coming back to social support, showing a willingness to help someone else. And as I said, helping somebody else could be very, very menial tasks. It doesn't have to be anything big. It's very important to show that you understand how somebody feels. This is what empathy is about. Okay, so now I've talked about just very basics about empathy. I talked about cognitive empathy. I've talked about emotional empathy. I've talked about social support. I've talked about resilience. I talked a bit about emotions. But how do we actually do it? How can we practice empathy? What do we actually do? How can we show that we are showing empathy? Well, of course, we need to be empathetic towards ourselves. We need to show ourselves empathy. So we need to keep, this doesn't just go for one person, this goes for all of us, as a general mental health rule of thumb, we should be, if we can, exercising, having good sleep, having, a good amount of quality sleep, making time to do the things that we enjoy. And making time to do the things we enjoy may just be reading a book. It may be, connecting with friends. It may be whatever you want to do. It may even be just sitting in your house doing nothing. Whatever it is that you enjoy doing in your own time, you should do. So we should show empathy towards ourselves. We should have some compassion for our own feelings as well, okay, before we can others. So when we go on to considering others, let's take the first one. Stop and think of those around us. Are we seeing somebody today in the office, in our neighbourhood, in the supermarket, wherever it is that we go? Are we seeing people who seem afraid or upset? Okay, let's take the workplace. We are all going through different things. As I said earlier, each and every one of us will be having some concerns or another. And that will, of course, depend on what psychologists call individual differences. We may not all be feeling despair or frustration or anger or stress or depression, but a vast majority of us may. So if somebody comes into work and they're not very happy and they don't talk to you and they seem alone, stop and think why that might be. If somebody's angry with you, in other words, they're a bit short, is there something wrong? Ask them, are you feeling okay today? Try to be aware of others' emotions and their experiences. Just now I talked about Paul Ekman's universal emotions. We don't have to be a psychologist to recognise people's emotions. If we have good communication skills or good awareness of others, and we can, foster that, we can train ourselves to be better at recognising other people's emotions. If we are aware of what others' emotions are, if we see someone feeling unhappy, we may want to be gently inquiring, show concern, and it can be very simple by saying, how are you today? Or I see that you're perhaps not looking very happy. Is there something I can do to help? Using words of kindness, hi, hello, how are you? How do you feel today? What did you do at the weekend? What do you enjoy doing? Means that you are taking an interest in somebody else. And be a source of encouragement by helping others to focus on the positives of a given situation. For example, Many people may be very negative about what's going on around them, but then we can look at positive things. Positive things might be things like, scenery, the weather, okay? Not, of course, when it rains. We don't want to be thinking about that, but we live in a beautiful country with wonderful weather, okay? The sun is almost always shining, so we can look at the clouds, we can look at the scenery, we can look at the greenery. So these are all things, when we just show a general understanding, probably, a lot of people may be what we might call self-absorbed. Self-absorbed meanings, they're not really aware of what's going on around them, okay? And that's not necessarily a criticism. It may just be that is the way that people are. But if we want to try and show feelings of kindness, in these troubled times, always remember that we're going through an unprecedented experience, which we at the moment don't know when it's going to end. Okay, so when we talk about practicing empathy, we might want to be thinking, okay, well, what can we do to help others? This is also called altruistic behaviour. Being altruistic means that you are doing other things for people. Might be helping them with their shopping, might be helping them with their tasks at work, might be doing any small task. Again, this links to social support. So everything links together. It doesn't stand in isolation of itself. How can we practice empathy? So again, we talk about this. So make time for others, including those who you do not normally have much contact with. That might be people in your neighbourhood, people who live in the same vicinity as you. They may not be your immediate neighbours, but they might be people that you see in the lift or in the grounds of where you live, asking about their welfare. One of the other things about showing empathy is being open to new ideas and opinions from others. Being able to take a step back and think their opinion or idea is at odds with my own, but I am going to listen to what others have to say. And that comes into being non-judgmental. Their opinions may not be what you like, but it shows that you are willing to listen. This last one here is paying attention to others' body language, which I'm going to say a bit more about a little bit later on this slide. Okay. We can all use basic communication skills derived from counselling. As I mentioned earlier, empathy, non-judgmental, these are all factors or things which come from the field of counselling. They are what we call basic communication skills. Now, although they are written about in counselling and they are studied on counselling courses, these are the mainstay of counselling skills. However, that doesn't mean to say that non-counsellors, people who are not counsellors, cannot use these skills. So how do we do it? So basic communication skills from counselling. Listen emphatically. But how do we do that? How can we listen emphatically? Well, the key issue is how you respond to others, okay? So if somebody's telling you that they are very upset, they're very distressed about they have a loved one living abroad and they can't visit them for some time, this could be an example. And many of us are experiencing that, including myself. So we listen emphatically. Somebody's telling you, I'm really worried. I cannot visit my relatives abroad and I don't know when I can do that. And it really worries me. So when you listen emphatically, you are using sentences and phrases like, oh, I see. Yes, I can imagine it must be difficult. I can understand how that must feel. It must be awful for you to think about that. So what you're doing there is you're putting yourself in that person's shoes. It may not relate to you directly because you may not have relatives overseas, but by thinking, I mean, we can all think how terrible and how worrying that must be. Body language, and we'll come back to this as well. This is part of counselling skills. Body language, the manner or the way in which you look at somebody. So somebody is telling you something that is at odds with your own feelings, perhaps something that you find a bit, disgusting maybe, or something that you don't really want to hear, by pulling faces which are indicative of that, then, that can show that you may not be, portraying a sense of empathy to that person. And again, that comes back to being non-judgmental. When people use body language, when they use faces or facial expressions which portray disgust or anger, let's imagine, that you are feeling very unhappy and you want to speak to somebody, that but that person is busy, and you say to that person, I just want to say something, but the person is looking very angry because they're busy and they don't want to be bothered with you. Well, that manner, that body language is going to give off the signal to you that they don't want to listen. So that comes back to what I said about making time for others. Active listening. What does that mean? What does active listening mean? Well, it's paraphrasing, but active listening actually is that you are actively listening and paying attention to what that person is telling you. So you are basically paying attention, because we can all be listening, but we may not be actively listening. So, for example, we might be at home, we might have the television on, our loved ones or somebody might be speaking to us. We're not really actively listening. We can hear what's being said, but we're not actively listening because we're probably perhaps on the phone or something like that. So that is not actively listening. But active listening is when you are facing the person again, the use of body language, you are looking at that person and you are paraphrasing. So you're going back to saying things like, so imagine if, again, your friend is telling you, I'm very concerned, I can't go back to my own country to see my family because because of Covid-19 and I don't know when I can go back and I'm really stressed about it. Paraphrasing is, would be repeating back to what that person said. Something like, oh, I see, yes. So what you're telling me is that, you're concerned that you can't visit your own country and your family. You're worried about it. Yes, I can see what you mean. It must be very worrying for you. I can fully understand. So this is some of the ways in which we can try and practice empathy. Take one step back and look and think, what is going on? What do I need to do here? How can I pay attention? How can I help this? These are things which we do teach our students as well. And it doesn't have to be, as I said, we don't have to be counsellors. These are basic skills, actually, which now in this current climate of COVID, that if we want to show care to people, that these are things that perhaps we should be thinking about. And again, social distancing does not mean emotional disconnection. So I'm sure, now we have WhatsApp, we have Twitter, we have Facebook, we have all these different modes of communication. So although we have to social distance, it doesn't mean that we have to have emotional disconnection. Even if we are working in an office or we're working with somebody or we are out and about, we can still show emotional connection. And greeting somebody with a simple hello and asking about their welfare can help a great deal. Okay, so I've talked about empathy and what it means, but what else can we do? How can we reflect on what we do? what can we actually do? Well, keeping reflective diaries are things which psychologists like to do, like to recommend. It may be something that some people aren't perhaps not very sure about, but I'm going to explain what that is in just a minute. Self-improvement is something which we can have if we keep reflective diaries. Self-improvement means, improving ourselves, our communication. It can also help us to build empathy and to practice it. If I go to this research from medical education, now medical education is a field of education which explores and looks at how we educate medical students, healthcare professionals. Now, I know that we're not talking about medical education today, but still we can use this principle because this relates to empathy, and this is something that we teach our students. So this research talks about a study which explored how guided reflective writing can invoke or, foster or encourage empathy in doctors. Qualitative analysis, so qualitative, of course, is research which is carried out via interviews, so where the researcher will interview the participant. They will record what has been said, and they will transcribe that and subject that to analysis. So what they did was they interviewed doctors and they did a qualitative analysis of doctors' reflective diaries, which showed an increase in levels of empathy and an ability to reflect on common clinical scenarios. So the results implied that reflective writing has the potential to help doctors think and reflect on their clinical practice. Now, of course, this is only one study. Very many others have been done. But what that shows is, that we can, increase levels of empathy by giving common scenarios in the doctor's practice. So that's a very interesting thing that we can think about. However, what does that actually mean? What does that mean for you? So you are not necessarily a medical doctor. Some of you may be, some of you may not be. So, but what does that mean for you as an individual? What can you do about reflective writing? Well, this comes from this slide or this diagram, which I put together, is adapted from Gibbs for medical education, which is about reflective writing. Reflective writing in the field of education, but it can also be used as a general framework for reflective diary keeping. So at the top, we can see a description of what happened. Then we can see the next arrow leading down to the feelings. What were you thinking and feeling? What was good and bad about the experience? What sense can you make of the situation? What else could you have done? And an action plan if the situation arose again. What would you do? So imagine you are, for example, you're in the workplace and somebody is very distressed, okay? And they are perhaps not very pleased. They might be angry, okay? Might be angry at you, or they might be angry at others. So what is going on with that person? How are you going to manage that situation? Okay, what did you say to make the person feel better? What was good about what you said and what was bad about what you said? Can you reflect on it and think about what you might say or do next time? What sense can you make of a given situation where somebody is unhappy? Can you use some of these skills that I've talked about in this talk about empathy? Can you use some of those ideas to help you understand? What else could you have done? We can all reflect. Sometimes we reflect and we think, oh, maybe I should have said that, or maybe I should have done this, or maybe I shouldn't have said that. Of course, once we've said it or once we've done it, cannot be undone. But this is where keeping a reflective diary of certain situations can help you reflect, so that perhaps next time the same thing may not happen. So an action plan. If something like that happens again, what would you do? How would you manage it? What would you do for next time? So reflective writing, and it has to be writing as well. The field of positive psychology talks very much about keeping reflective diaries, writing about good things which happen today. And we can all find, there's a positive psychology intervention which talks about, 6 good things which happen today. 6 good things could be minor things. It could be something like, well, today it didn't rain and I didn't get stuck in the jam. And so writing those things down can make people feel better, and it's been documented that it can do. So having a reflective diary simply relates to situations which you have encountered during the day, and you don't have to do it every day. You could perhaps do it once every other day. And the thing about reflective writing is not that you are typing it. It's recommended that you actually write it. So you write it in a diary or a book. And so you use the process of writing, because the process of writing, means that as you are writing, you are thinking about what you're writing. But when you type, it's like an automatic response that you are typing something. So maybe sometimes your thoughts might go ahead of what you are typing. So this is a framework that you could use to write a reflective diary. There are very many others. This is not the only one, but I've only put this in so that you can get an idea of what I mean by reflective practice. Writing about what happened. You could even use the positive psychology intervention, and write about 6 good things that happened today that went well. And that can go some way towards empowering people, making people feel, that they are in control of a certain situation. And I think that, during this COVID-19, many of us are disempowered because, of course, we are not able to do the things that we want to do because of the situation. So that is probably, a very common feeling at this current moment in time. So to conclude in this webinar, so I have discussed psychological factors related to COVID-19. I have talked about social support and resilience as protective factors. I have talked about the importance of empathy and how to practice it. So I've talked about counselling skills, which, as I said, we don't have to be counsellors to practice it, but we can take some of those skills and use them to help us practice empathy. I've talked about a reflective diary, which can help us for self-improvement, not just only to help us to think about how we can practice empathy and how we can treat others, but also, for our own self-improvement, what we can actually do in certain situations. So I think that the key, most important thing here, the underlying thing, is that we consider, in this current situation, just exactly how others may be feeling. If somebody's not feeling happy and they are a bit short or a bit angry, is there a reason for that? And there just might be. Okay, so this is a list of my references. And this is our counselling and support services. Those of you who are students or MAHSA staff will know that there are counselling services available for both staff and students at Student Central, which is in our Saljana Putra campus. And there is also the befrienders.org.my, which is a 24-hour support for anybody who may feel that they want to talk to somebody. Okay, so I do hope that you have all enjoyed this talk as much as I've enjoyed giving it, and I hope that I've been able to provide you with some practical support, practical help in how to apply empathy. You can email me. This is my email address. Sometimes people may, after the talk has finished, perhaps some people may think, oh, I have one question to ask, but that was not answered in the talk, or I thought about it afterwards in reflection. So this is my email address. So you are more than welcome to email me, and I'll be very happy to help. Okay, thank you very much, and do take care and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Thank you so much, Ms. Sharon, for a wonderful presentation, which is much needed during this pandemic. Thank you so much for stressing the importance of empathy in our everyday life and its psychological implications. We do have some questions from the participants actually, so I will try to take up one after the other. So, yeah, the first question is actually asked by Ahmed. So he's asking that can empathy be taught?
Can empathy be taught? Yes, it can. It can be taught. There are, I mean, I mentioned an article in my presentation, in my talk about, teaching empathy. And there are many other books that are written about empathy as well. So yes, it can be taught. It can be fostered. Fostered meaning, of course, that, as I've tried to do in this discussion, I talked about this is how we can do it. So yes, it can be taught. Certainly it can be taught. The principles of it can be taught, and ultimately practiced. So yes, that is true. It can be.
Okay, so I hope Ahmed got his answer, and then we have one more question. We have one more question from Thomas. So he's asking that what does it mean when a person has good interpersonal communication skills?
Intrapersonal communication skills. Okay. Intrapersonal communication skills relates to how we communicate to others. Those skills in the field of intelligence, so Howard Gardner's multiple intelligences, this is where it comes from, although not, of course, only Howard Gardner's intelligences, but he talks about things like interpersonal and intrapersonal. So intrapersonal skills again relates to reflection, how you reflect on how you have communicated with others. So it relates to, how you've met, how you've discussed something. Have you communicated clearly? Have you communicated something not so clear? But what could you do next time? And intrapersonal skills is extremely important for those of us working in the field of medicine, as educators, anybody really who is working with others. Those skills are very important to have. And again, they can be learned through training as well. So yes, that's what intrapersonal skills means.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas, for the question, and I hope you got the answer. And then we have one last question for the today's session. So it was asked by Shivaranjini, and she's asking that Miss Sharon, is empathy related to genetics?
Is empathy related to genetics? There are some studies which are saying that empathy can be genetic. But whenever we talk about genetics, so in psychology we have the nature-nurture debate when we talk about is behaviour nature and is behaviour nurtured, and so that age-old discussion of is it nature, is it nurture is a very difficult one to answer. There has been some evidence to say that, you know, around 10%, you know, that there can be some genetic element to empathy. My personal view is that it's probably more to do with learned behaviour. I mean, that's only my personal view. Again, when we talk about genetics and behaviour, it's not very easy to actually come up with a tangible answer. But there has been some research to say that, yes, it can be genetically inherited, you know, but again, as I say, when we talk about that, it cannot be so clearly defined. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's all the questions for today. And thank you so much, Ms. Sharon. It was really a much needed presentation during this pandemic. And then I thank all the audience for your value.
Okay, thank you
Yes,
very much.
Ms.
Yeah,
Sharon.
thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I thank all the audience for your valuable time in participating in this webinar and engaging in the question and answer sessions as well. I would like to extend my gratitude to the MAHSA University for organizing this event for the benefit of the community with regards to mental health awareness. So stay tuned to our MAHSA University Facebook page we will keep you updated about our upcoming webinar sessions. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Stay safe. Take care, everyone. We will see you soon. Thank you, Ms. Sharon. Thank you. With this,
Okay,
I'm
thank
going
you
to
very
end the
much.
broadcast.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you.